afternoon. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Andrew Scheiber. I'm from Cape Town, South Africa. It's really great to be here. Thank you for joining us in this afternoon session. And it's quite new and fantastic for INHSU to be expanding beyond viral hepatitis. It did happen in the previous conference last year, and now we're really exploring some of the important other key health issues affecting people who use drugs and looking at some particular infections. So we're going to hear about some research done around viral hepatitis B and D, some tuberculosis, and some soft tissue injury issues.
Hello. I am Sean Falade. I'm faculty at the Johns Hopkins University School of Medicine in Baltimore, and it's so exciting to be here with you all today, talking about infectious diseases beyond hepatitis C, although I will say hepatitis C is one of my favorite diseases because I can cure it. We're really looking forward to an engaging and informative session today. We're a small group, so please take your questions, come to the microphone, and I'll hand it over to my co-chair.
Great. So we have three speakers. We're going to ask the first speaker to come to the podium. We will have one person who will join us virtually, and at the end we will have a panel discussion. There is also an application where you can send your questions on, so please do so. So I'd like to invite Ms. Danielle Russell. Is Danielle here?
Andrew, I saw her outside, just give me a quick break.
Okay, we will. I'll read her intro, and then she can come in, and we can applaud her. How about that? Great. So we'll put her on the spot. So when she arrives, you'll know some background about her. She's currently a doctoral candidate at Arizona State University, where she studies how drug use has become a key tool for social control. Having personally experienced many of the harms that impact people who use drugs, she is passionate about mutual aid and working to change the structures that impose harms on the bodies of people who use drugs. And the topic is going to be on skin and soft tissue infections, personal reflections, and the need for transformative justice. And now we will wait a few minutes. So I know in the area that we work, tuberculosis is particularly problematic in the South African context. What is also a challenge is we have very little data on what's happening with tuberculosis. Similarly with soft tissue injuries, lots of our surveillance and our interventions are focused on HIV and increasingly over in terms of hepatitis C. So I think just getting a better understanding of what's happening in other contexts is very useful for the work that we do, but also to get a global perspective. I don't know what's happening in the US, if you'd like to give some reflections from your work.
Yeah, I mean, I think skin and soft tissue infections are such a critical part of the experience of people who use drugs. I do a lot of work on a mobile exchange van where we provide integrated, low-threshold services, and I will say that the service that's most often sought is treatment for skin and soft tissue infections. And it's just so critical that, as people engaged in this work and part of this community, that we're very informed about skin and soft tissue infections. We're able to make access to simple things that make a big difference in terms of whether a skin and soft tissue infection progresses to a limb amputation, for example. We need to get those interventions in place. Can I take a poll? How many in the room are clinical? Okay, so quite a number. Can I take a poll? How many in the room are in a position to have to see and try to address skin and soft tissue infections? Yeah, so quite a number. So it looks like it's a shared experience where we're all seeing skin and soft tissue infections. I do believe that Ms. Danielle Russell is in the room. You have been introduced, please. Okay. We're so excited to hear from you and hear about your personal reflections and the need for transformative justice relating to skin and soft tissue infections. Thank you so very much. Okay?
Sorry to apparently be a little late. Okay. Well, there we go. What was that? No, it's so cold. You know what? I might start shedding layers as we go through. So hello, I'm Danielle. I'm a gonna pour myself some water. I'm a doctoral candidate at Arizona State University. I do community-based research on issues that impact people who use drugs. And I know I'm gonna need this, so I'm getting it prepared. Especially related to like health equity. And I'm gonna talk a bit more about myself here shortly, and you'll see why drug user health, and especially chronic wounds and bloodborne infections. This is not just my research interest, but this is very much a part of my daily life. So, how do I go to the next slide? Just
Try rolling the ball
the ball?
on the mouse. On the mouse.
Just like the mouse.
Oh, okay. As you may have gleaned, I'm going to be talking about injection-related wounds or skin and soft tissue infections. So firstly, I'll give a bit of background on my own personal experience. I'll briefly talk about how chronic wounds have impacted my own life. Then we'll cover some challenges. And wow, there are a lot, but I've narrowed it down. Otherwise, I could be up here for hours talking about all the challenges, especially in accessing treatment and care for chronic wounds. And then, also let's consider some ways we could improve, and we can touch on what is needed to improve access to care for skin and soft tissue infections. I might use the acronym SSTIs moving forward as well to reference skin and soft tissue infections. And then we'll end by considering what we can do moving forward, and they asked me to leave you with some key takeaways, so hopefully I'll do that successfully. I'm going to talk a little bit about my own experience with chronic wounds. As I mentioned, I'm an injection drug user, have been for, probably a couple decades. The area I live in, when I was, initially using, we didn't have any access to sterile syringes. It still has very limited access to sterile syringes. It's like breaking the Da Vinci Code to find some rigs, often. And then despite millions of dollars in funding going to local harm reduction orgs, it's still very much a challenge to get sterile syringes. So basically, I would steal these very large gauge syringes for my job. I worked at an environmental and then an aerospace lab. And these weren't I would steal these syringes for my work. They weren't meant for humans. They were meant for very viscous fluids like aircraft engine oil. I'd end up reusing syringes long after they were very dull, injecting into my legs, so I wouldn't have any visible bruise on my arms, and I could hide from work, that I was injecting. And then I also strap on these heavy steel-toed boots, and if you've ever seen clean room boots, they cross right across your legs. So it's not exactly prime for healthy living. And I work 12 to 14-hour shifts, 5 days a week like that. So in roughly 2008, almost 14 years ago, my legs started swelling up. I ended up unable to even put my work boots on. My legs would start getting really red and puffy. And so I went to the doctor. They said this is cellulitis. Basically, they were just, stop using drugs. That's so helpful. Okay, and I didn't, surprise. But I also kept going to work and strapping those boots on every day. It got to the point where I would take off my boots. The straps would have blood on them at the end of my shift. So I went back to the doctor again. Skin's opened up. I even have him yell in my face sometimes, just stop using the drugs, you're gonna lose your legs, very dramatic. Apparently this wasn't dramatic enough for me, having strangers scream in my face would be helpful. So little did I know, this was just the start of a battle that I would still be fighting today. So I hope you guys aren't squeamish, but I do think it's important to share photos, just because it doesn't, I think that to really convey what I'm living with, and my wounds compared to a lot of my friends are actually pretty nice, and they're not stinky, so that's nice. I'm not stinky anymore. I'm not stinky. Hooray! Oh, oops. Okay. So as I worked to put these notes together, I wasn't sure how to talk about over a decade of the most painful experience in my life. Which attempts at getting help should I mention? What should I tell people about this? Just to say that the last decade has been marked by several attempts at getting help for this. Well, even this morning I was listening to someone talk about how to get people in touch with services, as if that's like the problem. And I was thinking, like, I'm in touch with services all the time. I'm on methadone. Like, I've been forced to be in touch with services every fucking day for a long time. So I would just so what you see on the slide are a few memorable quotes over the years that have stuck with me from doctors and nurses, as I have repeatedly attempted to get support. And so I hope, if I do nothing else speaking today, that I can disabuse anyone of the notion that people use drugs, that we don't just care about our health, our bodies, and our lives. Because from what I've seen, many of us try very hard to live healthy lives, and we thrive despite odds often stacked against us. So yeah, after my leg wounds opened up, I eventually, I ended up getting a referral to wound care. I think I still had insurance at this time, which being from the States, that's a constant battle as well. The first one, they did these god-awful wet to dry dressings, which, if you've ever did those, it's basically like a wax on, wax off, it sucks. And then they started doing compression and debridement, alternating all this. And the debridement sessions, I found out they were charging $30,000 per debridement session for basically something I could do in the shower myself with a bit of teeth grit and a shower head. And then so my insurance started rejecting that. I think I ended up with about $500,000 in medical debt. I haven't followed up, they can come take my nothing, I guess. I'm in school to be a doctor, I'm not one yet, so I'm still pretty broke. There's nothing for them to come take from me. But so within a year or two of my leg wounds opening up, my legs got to the point that I just couldn't even put my work boots on. I inevitably got laid off, which means I lost my insurance. So then it was even harder to get in front of doctors and have them moralize and opine on my drug use, so, big loss to me. But yeah, if I were to go into detail about all the years I've spent in and out of wound clinics trying to get help closing these wounds, we could be here all day. So I really want to make it clear that this issue hasn't just persisted for me because I just delayed seeking care, or that so many people I know that also have chronic wounds, because I know a lot, especially being on I'm on the border of the southern U.S. border with Mexico. It's black tar heroin. It's very very hard on your body. And just from my limited experience using heroin elsewhere, it's tar is very punishing to inject. If you miss, it's you know it. So just a lot of particulate matter as well, which I suspect, also leads to us having more wounds, in addition to just the lack of access to sterile syringes, and harm reduction supplies and support. So yeah, I really want to make that clear that it's not, and also because as a researcher, I read so much about how people use drugs normalize pain and the delay seeking health care, and the context of what you actually deal with as you try to seek care is often not included in all the research that I read. And I do refuse to seek care now, but this is only after years of having medical staff treat my body like a personal ATM machine. So I'm sure there's quite a few doctors in my hometown that probably have new Pebble Tech pools from the millions of dollars of healthcare that I guess I haven't received. So what can we do about this? I was thinking, I'm not an expert in finding a resolution, but I have managed to survive despite being offered very little support. So there is that. And I've realized that the issues I keep encountering in the healthcare system, my experience isn't isolated. I could tell you 50 stories, many much worse than mine, quite a few ending in death for people. But this isn't just a few bad actors or doctors, even though a lot of times the singular cruelty of a few bad actors does stand out. It's an entire system in need of transformative change. And as we heard, if many of you were at the opening ceremony, we heard Naim Eastwood, she was talking about like a fundamental reordering of like society is what we need. So I know we don't have much time, but so I did want to talk a little bit about transformative justice because, this is an entire system in need of transformative change. And so transformative justice recognizes that oppression is the root of all forms of harm, abuse, and assault. And as a practice, it therefore aims to address and confront these oppressions on all levels and treat this concept as an integral part to accountability and healing. And like part of this is bodily autonomy, especially in the States. Like we're seeing more and more assaults on bodily autonomy, especially like women's bodily autonomy and pregnant people's bodily autonomy. This is the foundation for gender equality, and above all, it's a fundamental right. And bodily integrity, it's the inviolability of the physical body and emphasizes the importance of personal autonomy, self-ownership, and self-determination of human beings over their own bodies. So I think that if this was more centered, especially in healthcare, which is so often alienated from people in their bodies and the treatment they receive, especially when it comes to drug use, just respecting that maybe other people's ideas of acceptable risk is not, doctors' ideas of acceptable risk, but this isn't a reason to prevent them from being able to access care. We're talking about hepatitis C, and like in many states, there's still sobriety requirements to access curative treatment for Hep C. And then also essential to transformative justice is dignity. And speaking of dignity, there's a crucial difference between services that support the needs, wishes, and priorities of people who use drugs through assistance and empowerment, and services that protect and maintain disabled people, primarily through sheltering and control. I think that's so often like how services aimed at people who use drugs are oriented, more towards the sheltering and control. So broadly speaking, you often hear the phrase, "nothing about us without us," which was used by the disability rights movement in the US in the 70s. And disability rights prioritizes freedom, choice, and the dignity of risk over protection, close supervision, and even sometimes over so-called positive outcomes. So while each person needs different kinds of support to meet their individual needs, it's always possible to craft effective supports in ways that are empowering rather than controlling, liberating rather than confining. And these goals can be more complex and challenging to ensure for some people than for others. I know I rushed through some of this. It is a little bit emotional to talk about something so personal to me, so I hope that some of it was legible, at least. And I'll just end by reinforcing that the demand "nothing about us without us" is critical here. It's not just a matter of whether any specific action objectively increases or curtails freedom or choice. It's about whether each person is able to make their own genuinely free choices in life, from the smallest preferences to the biggest decisions we all make. We all have to make trade-offs, but we should all be able to choose when and how to do so. And that is often missing in accessing healthcare. So I know those are not concrete, do this. They're more kind of broad ways to orientate yourself in the world, I guess. But that is what I came up with. So I hope you find something to take away from that. Yeah, I'm ending a little early, but I hope it was helpful.
Thank you so much for sharing such a powerful story. Could you please come sit with us? Because we're going to have a panel discussion at the end. Okay, so we're going to have a panel discussion at the end. Please keep your questions for Danielle. I am delighted to announce our next speaker, who will be joining us remotely via Zoom. Professor Heiner Wedmeyer is a full professor and head and chair of the Department of Gastroenterology, Hepatology, and Endocrinology at Hanover Medical School, Hanover, Germany. His main interests are the immunopathogenesis of hepatitis B, hepatitis C, hepatitis D, and hepatitis E infections, as well as the development of novel immunomodulatory therapies for the treatment of acute and chronic liver disease. He has authored more than 500 original articles on hepatitis B, hepatitis C, D, and hepatocellular carcinoma. We're delighted to hear from him today on the epidemiology, natural history, and treatment for hepatitis B and D infections, implications for people who inject drugs. Welcome, Professor Wedmeyer.
Thank you very much. I hope you can hear me. Thank you very much for the very kind introduction. And I'm really sorry that I cannot be on site, but it simply was not possible to arrange traveling in time. But it was already a very interesting start of the session. Thank you also for the first talk. My task is to talk about hepatitis B and D, and I will share some of my slides here, which you hopefully can see now. The most frequently asked question in the last 2 years. Can you see my slides? Okay,
So
Yes, we can.
very good. Okay, thank you very much these days. So I've been asked to talk about hepatitis B and D infections and the implications for people who inject drugs. And before starting in the printed program on the first version, I was listed as heading the department of the University of Essen in Western Germany. I moved back to Hanover 2.5 years ago, and you can see here Hanover, it's northern Germany. This is Hanover Medical School, and I'm sitting right now here in this area where you see here the hospital. You also see that Hanover is a quite green city. I'm actually living right here. Here's the zoo, and I'm going by bike each day back and forth. I don't own a car, which is also quite nice at Hanover Medical School. But why I'm highlighting this picture here is we're talking here about viral hepatitis. We're talking about an environment where we have good drugs for hepatitis B. We do not have good drugs for hepatitis D at this stage, but you need to further develop this one. And therefore, I think having an environment where we can bring together basic research institutes. For example, my lab is also in this building or part of our groups. We have a transplant service, which is located here, and here we are delivering our clinical services. So this really helps to develop things, and I will focus in my talk on hepatitis D virus infection. I'm happy to take questions on B mono infections also, but because here we have simply new drugs, and we need to really make sure how to use these new drugs, in particular in vulnerable persons. And we also have quite some people who inject drugs in Hanover. They are living, as frequently in Germany, through the around the area of the main train station, which is right here. So we had, for example, a distinct project ongoing in our department where we delivered hepatitis C treatment service. So we didn't ask the persons who inject drugs to come to Hanover Medical School and then get lost in this environment, but rather I sent some fellows to the distinct hotspots in the center of Hanover, where we then also could contribute to, let's say, cure of hepatitis C in this population. But Delta is still a problem, and that would be my focus of my talk. These are my potential conflicts of interest, which includes companies who I'm advised for example, clinical trial designs, drug development against hepatitis B and D. And I have to acknowledge my team here at Hanover Medical School and my previous place at Essen University. So this is my hepatitis alphabet. A is acute. B, I changed this until, let's say, 3-4 years ago. I stated here B is like boring, because treatment of hepatitis B was so easy. We have generic drugs. We have tenofovir, entecavir. You give 1 pill a day. They don't have side effects. They always work and prevent clinical endpoints. That was the initial answer. But B is back because we have new treatment ideas to cure also hepatitis B. We have many questions around also, let's say, vaccination, and we may discuss this during the panel discussion. C obviously is curable. E is emerging. In Germany, we have 400,000 hepatitis E virus infections every single year. 400,000. And this is also a matter, in particular for vulnerable persons, if they have, let's say, have a chronic liver disease and catch E on top. We just lost last month another 2 patients here at Hanover Medical School who had acute on chronic liver failure due to hepatitis E. So therefore, this is still something we should keep in mind, in particular, as in Europe, this is a zoonosis with pigs being the main, let's say, source for infections, and food. Raw pig meat is really a problem. But my talk is focusing now on D, and D stands definitely for devil, and that I will cover in the next 15 minutes. And I want to discuss with you one patient. It's a virtual patient, which is typical for many patients I see in Hanover. His name is Victor. He was not born in Germany, as most of my Delta patients. He was born in Uzbekistan. He was known to be HPV infected for more than 12 years, E negative. He still had some hepatitis. He received tenofovir. HPV DNA was suppressed, even though he had still hepatitis, and therefore the doctor was again and again telling the patient, well, stop drinking alcohol. You're from Central Asia, you're drinking a lot of vodka, you may have, let's say, some other risk behaviors, and that explains the hepatitis. And it took really a long time, 12 years being known HPV infected, before somebody had the idea to test for the co-infection anti-HDV. And in the end, he tested positive for anti-HDV. So what is Delta D? D is a defective virus. It cannot survive on its own, and it needs the hepatitis B surface antigen for dissemination. So that's basically Delta antigen. The virus is catching, hijacking HBV surface protein. There's no HBV DNA in this particle. Therefore, obviously, it's only a co-infection of B-infected patients, but it's an own infectious agent. We estimate 10 to 20 million people worldwide being infected, and it definitely causes the most severe form of chronic viral hepatitis with more rapid progression to cirrhosis and also a higher incidence of liver cancer. We'll come back to this in a minute. So overall, we really have to differentiate acute co-infection, which can lead to more severe acute disease. And this is happening in persons who inject drugs. So the only acute Delta patients I've been seeing here in Germany were actually PBIDs. While the majority of patients is actually with Delta, it's a super infection of a B carrier, usually during early childhood. And these persons develop chronic disease, which can take severe courses. As for many other viruses, we have different genotypes worldwide. We have distinct genotypes in Africa, but in North America and Europe, we're talking about genotype 1 infection, which unfortunately takes probably a more severe course than, for example, genotype 5, which we find in Africa. And then we have, in terms of epidemiology, we obviously have different data for general populations where there's the selection bias in hepatology clinics. In Europe, you can see here that there are some hotspots, for example, Romania, where high HDV prevalences can be found, also in other European countries. While in many, many countries, it's gray. We simply lack data. Well, I skip this one. Overall, we believe that really carrying the virus worldwide is between 7 and 10 million people in this globe, and in Europe we're talking about 285,000 viremic people. Talking again about risk groups, co-infected patients, we see a higher prevalence in persons who carry also the hepatitis E virus. You can see here that a triple infection, HIV, SHBV, and HDV is 14% of the B patients who carry Delta. We see also differences here in Europe, in particular in South Europe. There has been a high prevalence being reported, and also in Eastern European countries. Then talking about persons who inject drugs, we have data from North America. So our chair from Baltimore, there has been this very nice paper published 12 years ago, where they looked in a North American cohort of injection drug users, and they screened for hepatitis B patient, and then there was a serology tested for Delta. Because until 2010, when I've been talking to my fellow friends and colleagues from North America, they always told me, well, Delta may exist in Europe, but in North America, we do not see this. There is no Delta in the US. Obviously, it's all about testing. And when you don't look, you don't find it. And here in persons that really were drug users, they found prevalences here of 30% in old sera and even 50% of sera being taken in the 2000s. So Delta can be found in particular in injection drug users also in North America. So let's come back to Victor. So Victor, obviously, what do you do with Victor? He has hepatitis, he is anti-HDV positive. We have to do our HDV homework, and the RNA assay matters. I don't have time to discuss this in detail, but there are different in-house assays who are not good in detecting all viral genotypes. Also, quantification is an issue. We don't have many commercial assays. We have to do our HBV homework. We have to do our liver homework to stage really liver disease. One particular feature of Delta is that it may cause also some kind of autoimmunity. So Delta-associated autoimmunity, autoimmune hepatitis really matters. And this is the reason why I biopsy most of my Delta patients, which obviously we do not do anymore on a regular basis for B and C monoinfection. And when we did this, in this case, for example, the patient had also with this liver elastography really signs of advanced liver disease. The virus was detectable, B was low, and in the liver we found evidence for liver cirrhosis, but no features of autoimmune hepatitis, which is important because this makes the patient being treatable with type 1 interferons. Victor obviously then is asking what is his individual risk to develop clinical complications. I mentioned that Delta is the most severe form of viral hepatitis. And when you look to patients who have been like Victor, who have already liver cirrhosis, you see here that the event-free survival is very low. After 5 years, half of the patients really in Sweden, in this case, develop clinical complications. So it's really an aggressive disease. It's a malignant disease, which I think is really something people have to keep in mind. But not every patient is developing liver cirrhosis. Also in Sweden, there were some patients with a more benign course of liver disease. And obviously, it's now on us to really identify those patients where our treatment may be also deferred. And Delta also may cause cancer. Liver cancer is more frequent in patients with HDV infection. And for Victor, this means Victor, liver cirrhosis, HDV infection, he really needs to undergo cancer screening. And that is really critical for Victor. So Victor has already cirrhosis. He has a risk for developing cancer, to decompensation. And then he's obviously asking, what can Victor do? And we have in principle 5 options. Basically, to do nothing would be the first one, to continue the tenofovir treatment of hepatitis B. We can torture Victor with interferon, which may be not that, let's say, effective, may cause side effects. We have a new drug called bulevirtide. I will mention this in a minute, which we could combine with interferon, or are there new treatment trials? These are the principal options for Victor. So what's about the first strategy? Continue HBV drugs only. And here, let's say there have been quite some studies also from Switzerland, from the Swiss HIV cohort, for example, where they showed that in some patients, HDV RNA may decline spontaneously, but overall, there's no efficacy of these drugs against Delta. And this has been confirmed by others. This is data from Essen University, who have been chairing the department before. And you can see here, if you treat patients with NUCs alone, so tenofovir and entecavir, the outcome is really poor. While with interferon-treated patients, you have a better survival. This is obviously some kind of selection bias, but using NUCs alone is not the best option for Victor. What's about interferon? Interferon has been used for all hepatitis viruses, B, C, and Delta. There have been some trials. 10 years ago or 11 years ago, we published the first large randomized trial showing that roughly 1/4 of patients you may achieve HDV RNA suppression. Why I'm showing you this old data? Because we now followed these patients for 10 years, And what we published recently is that very late relapses after interferon treatment may occur. So in contrast to HCV infection, please do not use the term SVR. There is no sustained virological response after interferon treatment in Delta. Just look at patient 207. This patient was undetectable for HDV RNA at the end of treatment, and then he remained negative, and he relapsed 7 years after treatment, and we sequenced the viruses for the same virus. So it was no de novo infection or something. So follow your patients with Delta. And in this first trial, we treated patients for 1 year. We also published 3 years ago, if you extend treatment to 96 weeks to 2 years, the unfortunate thing is that during the second year, basically the virus is not further declining. You do not prevent relapse even by torturing the patient for 2 years with interferon. So not a good option, only 25% of benefit and only a proportion of patients can be treated. And now we have bulevirtide in our hands. It's received conditional approval by the European Medical Agency in Europe 2 years ago. It's not licensed yet in the United States. So what you can see here is, what is bulevirtide? It's a peptide. It's derived from the hepatitis B surface, and therefore it competes with the receptor of hepatitis B, and it's therefore an entry inhibitor. And the receptor is NTCP, which is a bile salt transporter, and therefore, and it's exclusively expressed on hepatocytes, and therefore this drug, bulevirtide, formerly called mercilessly, specifically binds to the hepatocytes. It exclusively targets liver cells, and it has really a strong inhibitory potential to block HBV and HDV entry. This was developed by Stefan Ober from Heidelberg. We just a few weeks ago, we published the phase 2 data where we showed that if you inject this drug on a daily basis, sub-Q, you induce a decline in HDV RNA. If you stop after 24 weeks, then the virus comes back in most patients, and overall significant HDV RNA decline was achieved here in roughly 50% of patients, as you can see here. What is very important, being a hepatologist, that liver enzymes really improved by this treatment. So many patients even normalized liver enzymes. So it's really a drug reducing the viral load and leading to an improvement in liver enzymes. A few weeks ago, we also presented the phase 3 data. This was the phase 2 data I just showed you. And at the International Liver Congress in London, I could show that in the phase 3 trial, we confirmed the good findings from phase 2 here after week 48. The previous data were after week 24. So after 1 year of treatment, half of the patients received a combined response, which was defined as a 2-log virus decline in combination with normal liver enzymes. And if you look at virological response alone, that's even 3/4 of the patients benefited. But we also could show that all subgroup of patients had a similar good response, irrespective of age, sex, race, or cirrhosis status. All patients benefit from bulevirtide treatment, which is really good news. Also patients with liver cirrhosis. And now the last question, obviously, is can you combine this also with interferon? So I showed you bulevirtide, I showed you the old data. What is about combination? And here we also performed quite some years ago already a phase 2 trial, which confirmed that if you combine both drugs, that you have a synergistic effect on treatment. More patients become HDV RNA negative as compared to either monotherapy. However, when you stop treatment, even here, many patients relapse, and at this stage, unclear whether really long-term benefit by combination therapy is really feasible in all patients, and here are trials ongoing. So let's come back now finally to Victor. Victor, we tried initially interferon, but he had side effects. He decided to stop treatment. Therefore, we started with the approved dose of bulevirtide, once daily, sub-Q injection of 2 milligrams of this peptide. Now you may ask, I didn't talk about side effects before. Does this really work? If you block a bile salt transporter, you would expect that bile salts should also increase. And this is indeed what we saw here. So bile salts increase. But what I have to highlight, that there was no patient reporting systemic itching. So bile salts per se did not induce itching, as some of us may have learned during your, let's say, hepatology training. What you may observe is in some patients are some local site reactions here, which we show that it may be in single cases a T-cell driven allergic reaction, but you can manage this quite well. And for Victor, this meant that he could be treated. This viral load declined substantially, was not undetectable. And the last question we are currently answering is now, how long should then Victor receive this peptide? Is it a maintenance treatment for life? Is it something where we may stop treatment after a certain time? I don't have the answer now at this stage. This is something which is investigated. There have been case reports from Milan presented at EASL, where after 3 years of treatment, the patient received, treatment was stopped. He received a liver biopsy, and you can see on the right side that the liver was cleared. So, which suggests there may be finite treatment possible. On the other hand, there was a patient from Vienna, which was also treated for almost 2.5 to 3 years. They stopped treatment and this patient relapsed. So we don't know yet at this stage whether we can stop treatment with bulevirtide. This is something I may answer in 2 to 3 years. There are also alternative, I will rush through this data, that there are alternative treatment options in development. There's a drug called lonafanib, which is a so-called prenylation inhibitor, which blocks packaging of the virus. A phase 3 trial has fully been recruited. Data will become available early next year. And there are other ideas which are currently explored. And again, if there would be questions, would be happy to answer them during the discussion. So my message is, yes, Delta, we have new treatment options. They are available in some countries, or they become available in many other countries. And now it's really our job to personalize management for individual patients with chronic hepatitis B and D, in particular also to explore what this means for patients also who inject drugs. And all patients with liver diseases, we definitely should recommend coffee. You all know this. Coffee is good for the liver. And the most important point is this is a dose-dependent effect. So the more, the better, and filtered coffee with caffeine is the preferred, let's say, way to do a good thing for your liver. Thank you very much.
Great, thank you, Professor Waldemar. So from hearing from hepatitis A, B, C, Devil, and E, we'd like to now invite our next speaker to come to the podium, please. That's Professor Al Story, who is the founder and clinical lead of London's Find and Treat Outreach Service, with his research interests being in the co-design, testing, evaluation, and integrated care models and interventions to address extreme inequities experienced by inclusion health populations. Specific disease areas of expertise and interest include tuberculosis, blood-borne viruses, COVID, and other respiratory infections.
Thank you very much. What a pleasure to be the great imposter again at a conference about Hep C, talking about TB. Everything you need to know about TB and drug use in 20 minutes. Fasten your seatbelts, there's a hell of a lot of slides. This was the plan they gave me. Probably not going to talk about much of this. No, I'll give it a go. But reality, this is the little fecker. This is Mycobacterium tuberculosis, a pathogen that's evolved with us from the primordial soup. It came out of Africa with Homo sapiens. It's been here forever. And yet, it remains the leading killer on the planet of any single infectious agent. Estimated 1.5 million preventable deaths a year. Whew. Over 10 million new cases diagnosed a year. That's just cases diagnosed. And an estimated 1 in 5 people infected, or at least would demonstrate a response to the rather rubbish tests we have for infection. It's been chronically neglected and underfunded for decades. This is very evident when you go to conferences. If you've ever been to a TB conference, you could die of thirst. I've I've been to a few Gilead and sort of HIV-sponsored events, and I developed a serious fine wine habit and put on 2 stone eating vol-au-vents. But it's massively underfunded. 70% of the cases are in your lungs, but it's a disease that can affect any organ. It literally can set up shop anywhere. Brain, bone, liver, you name it. TB loves it. Why is it in the lung? Well, mainly because that's how it gets in. This is TB harming. This is how to protect yourself from tuberculosis. It's a respiratory pathogen, and that's how it's spread. Unfortunately, it's spread by a lot of people who don't even know they've got it. This is the densest, the most impenetrable slide I have, but I think there's a pointer. Is it moving? It's impossible. I'll point and shout. Basically, this end is what we used to call latent TB infection. This end is rip-roaring active TB disease. And we used to think it was kind of a bit on and off. You get latently infected, and then, blip, you develop active TB. Well, that's rubbish, because you can lounge around for years writing romantic poetry. You know, Orwell knocked out 3 books after his diagnosis. We now know that it waxes and wanes. It's a continuous fight, the host versus the pathogen. It's your immune system at continuous war to suppress this nasty, dormant, but equally capable of waking up and replicating bacilli. And in reality, I'm interested in the red end of the spectrum in particular, where it starts to get about here, because I like screening. I like early diagnosis. This is basically the point at which it becomes detectable in the lung. This is basically the point at which we can culture the bug. This is the point that you have symptoms. What are the symptoms? Well, unfortunately, the slides have stopped working. What if I press something wrong? Oh no, need assistance. Stop, go away. Keyboard, no keyboard. We've got a complete freeze. No, we haven't, we're back on. Symptoms. Bug in lung wants to get out and kill other people. That's the mission. It's the mission of the pathogen. It hitches a lift on very small droplets that just come out when we talk, when we breathe, on the steam that we breathe, and it gets into other people. It causes, as a pulmonary disease, it causes cough, fever, sweating, weight loss, tiredness, coughing up blood, etc. But very, very vague and generic in some people. The symptoms are not great markers, particularly when we're talking about our service. Our service is an inclusion health service. It serves people experiencing homelessness. It serves people with histories of imprisonment. It serves people who are sex working and actively using. And if I wander around with my nice little symptom questionnaire, anyone got a cough, anyone feeling a bit, anyone lost weight, everyone's got TB. So symptoms, very non-specific, not particularly useful. So what I'm interested in is early diagnosis. The longer you're undiagnosed, the more people you will infect, and more importantly, the more advanced your own disease will be. But our tests are quite positively 19th century. On this end of the spectrum, you can see the tuberculin skin test. Some of you may have heard of it. It's been replaced by a better test recently, but it's a blood test. It needs whole blood. It's called the interferon gamma release assay, but you don't need to remember that. As you start to sort of percolate up the spectrum towards clinical disease, we can see it radiologically, and then towards the end, we can get some good old sputum and grow the bug, or put it in one of those lovely expert machines that everyone uses for Hep C and don't know also do TB. So why the X-ray? The X-ray is the best tool we have. Yet 19th century diagnostics dragged kicking and screaming into the 21st century by making it digital and mobile, basically. Radiology. What's wrong with this? Nothing. Perfect. Keep your eye on this area here. This guy was in a hostel. Let's go back 18 months later. We'll image him again. He's got these beautiful little preclinical opacities here. And lo and behold, we get the bug out of him, and he's part of the largest outbreak of drug-resistant TB ever documented in Europe. and he's in a prison. He's on remand. So he goes to court, he's released. Luckily, they're giving him a letter to say that you've got TB and you've got to take these pills, and so make sure you go to a hospital. What do you think he does? He doesn't, does he? 18 months later, carried into ED, moribund. He's totally cachectic. He's going to suffer respiratory problems for his whole life because this bug has eaten most of his lungs. He survived, amazingely. But without treatment, we know if you've got clinical disease, within 5 years, more than half of us will be dead. Yep, it's a very high mortality. Untreated TB carries an incredibly high mortality. Even in the subclinical cohort we're learning now, there's still a very high mortality, a much higher mortality than you would think, which is why it's one of the leading killers on the planet. Treatment has improved dramatically in recent years. You can lie around in your sanatoria with good food, fresh air and hope. No, there has been some pretty good advances. I found this in the Lancet, 1887. A new method of treatment of consumption and other diseases of the respiratory organs by gaseous rectal injections. This one didn't catch on, but is still available privately. Cutting to the chase, we first started TB notification surveillance in 1913. And as you can see, rates came down, with the exception of World War I and World War II, rates came down dramatically, both in terms of case numbers and deaths. It wasn't until the advent of 1943, which we do claim as the world's first randomized controlled trial, it wasn't until the advent of streptomycin that any kind of curative therapy became available. All the patients who went on to strep monotherapy developed strep resistance, and the vast majority later relapsed and died. Along came paraminosalicic acid, which is disgusting. That was the first combination treatment. Paraminosalicic acid, injections of streptomycin for 18 months. Reasonable cure rate. Add isoniazid. We had an 18-month 3-drug regimen that cured about 60% of people. It wasn't until the 80s that we actually combined the 4-drug regimen, which is the same regimen as we're using today. We haven't added a new drug to the frontline treatment for TB since the last one was developed in 1963, rifampicin. Mind-blowing, mind-blowing. And so we're still stuck with a regimen that works, but it's too long, it's too toxic, and it's too horrible. It's long. Normal TB treatment is 4 drugs for 2 months and then 2 drugs for another 4 months. That's a bucket load of pills. The new kid on the block, or as has been emerging, under our noses quietly for decades now, are bugs that are resistant to those frontline drugs. And particularly if we lose rifampicin, we've lost our wonder drug. And we're looking at 18 months of treatment. It's only still very recently that we introduced an all-oral regimen. That's someone holding their daily dose for an all-oral regimen for multi-drug resistant TB, which they will have to take for at least 18 months. It's only recently we removed injectables, and those aminoglycosides used to make most people deaf and give people chronic, lifelong peripheral neuropathies. The toxicity of the second-line drugs is horrific, and MDR-TB is threatening to take us back to the future, which is why I put the comply, concord, adhere, and take on the bottom, because this is the sort of history of the evolution of TB treatment delivery. We have always been quite serious about trying to support people to take that nasty, long, complex treatment. We've used all the wrong words: compliance, concords and aircraft, adheres, glue. I like take. I'm a big take guy. But, reality is there's almost no literature around supporting people to take DAAs, which again is an interesting sort of comparison between Hep C. So let's look at the UK epidemiology. Cases are coming down dramatically. About 4,500 new cases were diagnosed last year, which was a slight increase from the year before. About a third of them are in London. Very concentrated in our major cities, but pretty much can be anywhere. But while these rates are coming down, while the total number of cases is coming down, the proportion of cases who've got what's termed in the surveillance system social risk factors is increasing. About 7% of cases actually report drug use, but it's massively underreported because it's not capturing any historical last few years, etc. It's only capturing current in nearly all cases. And not wishing to be too harsh on my colleagues, they're not the best at actually sensitively inquiring into your habits. So massively underreported. About 14% of all cases have got one or more of those three things, drug use, homelessness, or prison, but they massively overlap. They're hugely intertwined. It's classic inclusion health. TB and drug use is a challenge. It's associated with a much higher risk of infection. Then it's associated with a consequent higher risk of progressing to disease. Lots of delayed diagnosis because of challenges using our building-based services and recognizing the symptoms with consequent very severe disease, as you saw in X-ray. It's now associated internationally with high risk of drug-resistant disease because people stop and start treatment, and they end up in a cohort where the predominant circulating organisms are drug-resistant. They get primary infection with drug-resistant TB. Unsurprisingly, it's highly associated with not completing your ironically called short-course treatment, and consequently, it's very much associated with onward transmission and outbreaks and preventable death. What do we do when we diagnose someone with a case of TB? We screen their contacts. We invite them into the hospital and we interrogate them. Who have you infected? Does it work when we're looking at people who are slightly more interesting than me? No. So that's why we basically launched an entire sort of active case finding agenda. We started with TB because that was the only diagnostics that were available to us. I love this photo. Can you read that? This was the fleet assembled in the 50s, mass mobile radiography to tackle what was probably one of the highest rates of TB in any UK city at the time. And, it worked, but as the case detection rate came down, we junked the entire fleet, installed deep fat fryers, parked them outside the Arsenal ground, and that was the end of mass mobile radiography. Not so the Dutch, they're much smarter than we are. They kept screening anyone with any risk factor, anyone going into a drug treatment service, anyone going into prison, anyone going into a hostel, screen. They fished themselves out of business. We borrowed one of theirs way back in 2002 and never looked back, and we've been hammering it ever since. We're currently one big van and one little van. How does it work? Well, basically, we take the service to people and we target based on what are the intersection points on the map: the hostels, the drug treatment services, the prisons, the street population, sex workers, etc., etc. And it doesn't work without this. This is the most essential and vital ingredient. This is the glue that makes the service stick. The reality is our notion of cure is come and work for us. Yep. Reality, as far as TB is concerned, is it comes at the end of a very long and hard road for some people. And I don't say this candidly. I would say for many people, the diagnosis has been a good news story for them. It's been an opportunity to actually get the help that they've deserved for many, many years, some of those people included. 11 tons of radiology. Welcome to the 19th century. It's the only tech we've got that can deliver results on the spot, and results on the spot actually make a difference. Quick radiology quiz. What's wrong with him? 12-gauge shotgun. Let's move. You see some interesting things on the street. Yeah. 7.62, if anyone's thinking. It's a Russian round. Right, if anyone can spot this, I'll buy them a pint. They haven't swallowed a zip. It gets more interesting. Look at that. A snapped needle from femoral injecting. Lodged, travelled and lodged. What's that? Yeah. So you got it in mono. I have this in reserve just in case people don't get it, because we got it in stereo recently, which was superb. Why am I talking about crack? Well, very quickly, a 30-year-old male's crack user, he presents to ED with hemoptysis. He's coughing up blood. They, oral antibiotics, presumed bronchitis, bugger off. 2 weeks later, he's back, same problem, hemoptysis. They say, okay, we'll image him. Chest x-ray's got a little opacity. Let's take a slice. He's got a 4 centimetre long, 1 centimetre wide piece of jagged glass lodged in his left main stem bronchus, and he has no recollection of aspiration. How is that possible? What is crack? It's cocaine. What is cocaine? It's an anesthetic. Crack cocaine anaesthetizes your airway in seconds. It's hot as hell and full of nasty toxic shit. It is nuclear warfare on the lung fields. This is one of the harming agendas that's just not known across the sector. The reality is, why am I talking about it in the context of a TB talk? Because it's linked. Crack is resulting in, crack is resulting in rip-roaring infectious disease and is associated with massive outbreaks. Think TB. It works, the treatment, if you take it, but there are challenges. TB is infectious. We need to isolate you, we need to provide care and support. It's toxic, yep. There's lots of drug-drug interactions, particularly if you've got Hep C infection, it increases, TB treatment increases risk of toxicity. So let's treat Hep C before latent TB infection, but let's not ignore latent TB infection. Rifampicin accelerates the rate at which you chew through your opiates. It will massively increase risk of people with getting breakthrough and withdrawal. Some patients need double the dose of methadone in order to survive a course of TB treatment. And then back to the massive challenge, it's bucket loads of meds, and it goes on and on and on. Adherence. We need to do this to prevent the emergence of drug resistance, to prevent relapse and death. How do we do it? Services have got to get smart, integrating with OST, incentivizing it. Our own agenda, learn from TB, big digital health agenda, and most importantly, accommodation. Very quickly, this is a trial published quite recently in The Lancet. We randomized people to a smartphone support versus clinic support. Smartphone creamed it. Give people the tools to get on with it. Yep. Why don't we do this for Hep C treatment? We just guess. Maybe Hep C treatment's so good you just got to walk past a packet of pills and you're cured. House them. Amazing. Yep. A home leads to a 3 times increase in treatment completion for really long, nasty, toxic courses of treatment. But, as we well know, and we learned very early on, out there screening for TB is doing a massive disservice to everybody we work with, because TB is not the only problem. There's a huge burden of LTBI. This is UK data, and a huge burden of Hep C, and a very high detection rate for HIV in the population that we serve. The collinearity between these two endemics, this syndemic between TB drug use and Hep C, is really driven by social violence at the end of the day. But just highlight in red, from this piece of work, which is contemporary, only a few years old, 29% of the Hep C positives had latent TB infection, and a quarter of the latent TB infected had Hep C. That's people with a history of experiencing homelessness, etc., and drug use. And they have no access to any kind of testing or treatment. So what have we done? We've upped the ante. We're a one-stop shop screening service now that basically covers every base. No one comes anywhere near us and doesn't get something. So, take-home messages. Latent TB infection is here. It's a big-ticket issue in the UK. It's completely ignored. Active TB is a common event. It's more than 1 in 20 of all the cases diagnosed in the UK at the moment are currently using. That's a massive orders of magnitude risk. It's a serious health issue. And despite great local guidance and clear international guidance that we should be actively out there testing people for latent TB infection, there's almost no access to care in this country. I'm so close. We do have better tests. We can use them, and we do have better drug regimens. New kid on the block, rifampicin, 28 doses, and you're done. So, last take-home message. We should do something, and we should do it together. Yep. Reality is, if you're going to make a hole in someone, add IGRA. It's cheap. We need to get serious about this. This is my mantra, and thank you very much.
Wow, such tough diseases. Any questions from the group?
Technically, your last message was doing the IGRA testing. My experience is that, as you mentioned, needs whole blood, but it also needs to be processed in a short amount of time. A lot of what's happening here is decentralized, and obviously what you're doing is decentralized. Are you doing those tests on site, or are you partnering in some other way to get those tests to the lab after the process?
We are not commissioned to do any active case finding for latent TB infection. Almost no services in the UK are. I mean, Americans think we're insane. The test isn't perfect. Time to lab is good enough to mass test in drug treatment services, to mass test in criminal justice environments, to mass test in hostels, etc. It works. I agree with you, it's a pretty crap diagnostic in terms of the wonder tools that we've got around Hep C and HIV, but you know, it's the best we've got at the moment. There's some really good stuff on the near event horizon that's looking at some better signatures to actually further tune who we should be prioritising for treatment, but at the moment it's that same old story of neglect and underfunded research.
I have a question. Why is TB so neglected as far as?
Well, it's just not sexy. You know, no one likes sputum, I think, is probably the main problem. Internationally, it's a disease where 90% of the deaths occurring in the world's poorest, many of whom go undiagnosed. It's the entire sort of pharma agenda around tuberculosis is basically a story of failure. There is almost no incentive to invest in developing better treatments, and consequently no incentive to invest in better diagnostics. There's been a bit of a pickup in the last few years. We've got some good stuff on the market in terms of new drugs, botonimab, daclin, but there's been such a long period of neglect. I mean, to be stuck with a 4-drug, 6-month regimen, the last drug added to that was 1963, blows my mind.
For those of us joining us virtually, please feel free to put your questions in the app. We have 2 microphones for those that would like to ask questions in the room.
Could I just ask a question? I was really curious to hear about rifampicin, because that stuff gives me nightmares. Is there still contraindications with other medication for that? Because I was on warfarin, and I was on rifampicin, and it stopped the warfarin working, and I ended it up in with pulmonary embolisms, but they couldn't get the line into me to do the bit that they needed with the PE, and none of them knew about the contraindications. So
I was going to dedicate 15 minutes to this talk to drug-drug interactions related to rifampicin, but you know, reality is it's not great. You know, particularly if you're on ART, if you're on the pill. I mean, the list is endless. And again, it just shines a very bright light on the fact that we are using a selection of drugs that are a little prehistoric, you know, when you compare them to the technological revolutions around HIV and Hep C in recent years.
Pascal Mellin from France. Just a question about hepatitis D. Don't you think the take-home message most important today is we need absolutely to vaccine drug users about hepatitis?
You're on mute?
I hear you. Can you hear me? Yes. Okay, so no, thank you for this question. I think that there are 2 points. The first one is we need to protect everyone from hepatitis B infection, then you are protected from hepatitis D. There's no doubt. But the problem is that there are 10 million people or more worldwide where obviously they have already been infected. And there, the most important point is we need to screen. So it doesn't, we can only help these patients if we know that they are infected. And that's, I think, the most important point. We need to talk about this infection. It's a serious infection, and therefore all hepatitis B surface antigen positive individuals worldwide should at least once be tested for anti-HDV. This is, to me, probably the most important message. And then we can talk about sophisticated treatments which are in development. Here, to me, it's more important to give the message is worthwhile of testing. The one is testing. The other is we have to have tools to really treat the disease. As we just heard in tuberculosis, we have drugs. Yes, they are complicated, but it doesn't help if we don't screen and we don't know if they are infected. And I think this is, to me, for all of the issues we've been discussing in this session, is the most important one. I have one question, if I may ask, on the tuberculosis issue again. Could you comment on the, maybe a little more detail on the effects of the pandemic? Do we have data on tuberculosis care during COVID times? And maybe, let's say, a medical question, is there data on, well, you just discussed the issue of drug interactions. We have, but what's about COVID infections and tuberculosis in the course of disease?
Thanks for the question. The pandemic, I mean, we've been rather insanely brave and joined the elimination bandwagon in terms of tuberculosis, which sounds quite a tough job when you compare it to viral hepatitis. The pandemic is, by WHO's own announcements, said to have set us back 5 to 10 years. Reality is every single country in the world is seeing a bounce back in terms of cases. Staying at home on a lockdown was, not great if you're sharing your airspace with someone who has got a cough and feels a bit grog, but luckily is testing negative on a lateral flow for COVID. There's been huge numbers of delayed diagnoses internationally, and the more, let's say, robust and harsh some of the lockdowns were, the more damage has been done to the program. In terms of the sort of, the how COVID is potentially, contributing towards reactivation and, ongoing lung damage and the relationship between long COVID and TB. I think that ticks every box that shouts underfunded, etc. We're seeing a tsunami of, HIV-related good science being done around long COVID, etc. But there is probably a relationship in terms of TB. We don't understand it, and there's certainly not much evidence of investment in understanding it. Thank you for the question.
Yeah, Richard Andrews from Houston, Texas, for Dr. Story. I was wondering, you talked about the co-infection with Hep C and TB. Are you screening for Hep B in these patients, and are you seeing much of that?
We are. And Hep B is one of the, the few good news stories in the UK. We were pretty on it in terms of good access to needle exchange quite early on. And we have actually quite low rates of Hep B chronic infection in the populations that we're serving. Very high rates in people who've come from other countries. But nevertheless, it's there. And nevertheless, for me, that represents one of those other classic examples of an intervention inequality. The biobanks, the basic science work, that doesn't represent the population that we serve. And they're going to be at the back of the queue when we actually unveil, anything near curative. So I do believe that we should be hugely incorporating Hep B into all our all our case detection work, all our clinical workup.
And I had one more question for Dr. Vedermeyer. You mentioned hepatitis E, and I was surprised to hear those numbers. Is that something that other countries are also reporting?
Yes, so obviously in Europe, we have quite some data on hepatitis E. There has been data from France and from the UK. We also have different clades of hepatitis E, genotype 3. I think 5 years ago, hepatitis E was called the Brexit virus when Brexit was discussed, because the message was that the poor British population to be contaminated by food from the Netherlands, where all the pigs were infected. So that was a discussion 5 years ago. No, but quite frankly, in Europe, we consider a zero prevalence. And let's say if you have a 60-year-old population of 20 to 50% of hepatitis E previous exposure, in North America, it may be slightly lower. If you look into blood donors, you find in Germany, for example, 1 out of 700 blood donors carries the hepatitis E virus. In the UK, there was a Lancet paper 8 years ago, almost similar numbers. So E is there, and it's for us almost impossible to escape from hepatitis E. I can tell you that myself, I am antibody negative actually, but I have an extremely good T cell response against hepatitis E. I have a fellow in the lab working on T cells against hepatitis E, and they are using my blood as a positive control. So I think probably all of us have been exposed, maybe not infected, but at least exposed to the hepatitis E virus. And the last word is even in drinking water. In Denmark and Germany, HEV has been found. So HEV is simply there.
So Danielle, I've got a question for you. Where we work in South Africa, there's a lot of soft tissue injuries because the needle and syringe service coverage is very poor. And some of the medical doctors who are having to see the complications and manage amputations, etc., have, I think, given very poor service to people. But are there any, you mentioned some of the principles that clinicians can use to, I think, be more aware of soft tissue injuries, but are there any ways that, for advocacy purposes, that we can better advocate for access to sterile injecting equipment, in particular in rural areas or areas outside of urban settings, as part of why harm reduction is so important? You know, what would your recommendations be?
Well, I mean, I think even if you're advocating to politicians, I mean, perhaps some of the like graphic pictures of what can happen and like how long that can last, even after people, you know, may stop injecting for years and still have to deal with those wounds. I mean, you know, when I was in Cape Town, I noticed that they actually had a lot of very accessible wound care, like at the pharmacies, which I was surprised because it was like the Adaptic and stuff that I wouldn't be able to get in the States very easily. But yeah, I think just, you know, letting people know how grievous injuries can be and, you know, limb loss and all that, hopefully move people to make sure people have access to the stuff they need to stay healthy and safe, you know, regardless if they're using.
Thank you so much. I have a question. So as I sat here and thought about the framework that I think many of us use in meeting people who use drugs where they are and making care accessible where they are, I couldn't but struggle with how to make this care for soft tissue infections, care for tuberculosis, care for hepatitis D accessible. I'd love to hear from each of the speakers your thoughts on how we can begin to create models of care that increase access to each of the conditions you spoke about. Could we start with you, Ms. Russell?
Sure, yeah. I mean, I've been thinking about that a lot, especially being here at this conference, because I've tested positive for TB. Like, I mean, I've been treated by the health department. Mary's, everyone. But, and hepatitis C, I hit the superfecta, you know, like going into the methadone clinic, they test you for everything and then hit you with like a big wall of like crap that, you know, leaves you kind of feeling less like, oh, I've got this, and more like, wow, like this is a big insurmountable hill I have to climb. So I think maybe even if services didn't bombard you with just like what feels like a wall of shame and just insurmountable stuff to deal with. I mean, I'm pretty privileged as far as a lot of injection drug users. I mean, I'm a PhD student. I have, like, at least at this point, a lot of education that hasn't opened as many doors for me as one might think as far as getting access to care. But yeah, I think just, I don't know what it would take to make it accessible, because I feel like even for myself, I have to balance out, like, which thing is more likely to kill me, or, like, you know, you're balancing out which horrible crap is on my plate that I have to deal with is the horrible crap that I'll deal with today. So I think, like, even, I think it was yours, was talking about, like, housing people when you have less horrible crap on your plate to worry about. Like, you know, as you remove those kind of, like, social barriers that exist for people, then maybe the other ones become less insurmountable. Yeah, I don't know if that's quite an answer, but.
No, it is. Thank you so much. Professor Story?
I mean, it's the question of the day, isn't it, really? The reality is, you know, if we look at what health services have provided, we all bandy around the word holistic, etc., but most of us are just lifting a specific chapter out of the Oxford textbook of medicine and following our own unique interests in a specific condition or a specific bug. That's why, you know, we coined the term people, not pathogens. You know, if you look at the data on the populations that we serve, infection's an issue, but what really robs them of life, of healthy years of life, is early onset complex comorbidity, particularly characterized by the early onset of long-term chronic conditions that are undiagnosed and unmanaged. They don't benefit from the wonders of modern science. One of the reasons why they don't is because too many services look at them through a very, very narrow lens, almost through a microscope, and miss so many opportunities to engage people in long-term care that they are entitled to. That's, I think, what we've got to move towards. We've got to be honest about holistic care, and holistic care isn't looking at it through the lens of a pathogen. And secondly, I think we've got to be able to sort of this community here in this conference, I mean, is just so refreshing because it clearly recognises the fact that we can't do this job unless, you know, it comes from the bottom up. It comes from the heart of that population who have seen it and breathed it. Reality is, if we continue to be paternalistic in the way we're designing services and not see the people who are receiving services as absolutely integral and essential to the solution, we'll fail. And that is where I think we can pay a massive community dividend to the entire field of healthcare in leading the way on these agendas.
Thank you very much. Professor Wedmeyer? You're on mute again. You're muted.
As just mentioned, can you hear me? Yes.
Yes.
So, okay. So this is obviously the most important question, and thank you also for the question. And obviously, this is what the conference is about. You've been discussing viral hepatitis during the day, different settings, different ideas to outreach the people. And yes, this holds true for maybe different settings in different countries and so on. Two points from my side. First of all, regarding the specific question of hepatitis D, this is even more complicated. And we need to talk about this because here we don't have this perfect drugs like in hepatitis B and D. We can either use interferon, which is challenging in particular in this population. Then we also have the problem with a new drug, which is, we don't know yet. It's very expensive. I can tell you 1 year of treatment in Germany costs 100,000 euros with bulevirtide. So I think there's a long way to go. But for me, the other way around, I think it's more important when we talk about outreach programs, how to make this possible on all different levels. We have to support the people that are really trying to fight for this. And I think this is, they need to get rewards. It's their life. They are passionate. And I think we need to applaud them on a daily basis. When I mentioned here on my first slide, when I showed you the map of Hanover, when here locally They are, in the end, care of the persons who inject drugs with wound infections, with skin diseases, etc. In the end, it's driven by 5 to 6 people here in Hanover who are really passionate. And if if they would, let's say, move away or so, we wouldn't need to start from scratch. And I think that we need to make sure that these people are supported, that they can spread out. In the end, any service is delivered not by systems, but by people. And that's my main point, that we really need to support them.
And share my experience working in Baltimore. So the Baltimore City Health Department, the local health department actually supports treatment for all TB cases, so that if a person is diagnosed with TB, the treatment is covered. If there's no housing, they're offered housing. Treatment traditionally was direct observed therapy, but the health department has now implemented video DOT, so that people can actually take their medications, take a video of them taking their medications and receive their therapies. And as we think about integrated models, the health department also has a van. It's called Care on the Spot. It's the Spot van that offers access to buprenorphine, hepatitis C testing, hepatitis B testing, HIV testing, even skin tests for TB. And one of the things that we are trying to learn as a medical community is how to take better care of wounds. I think part of the issue is that as providers, we don't all have experience doing that. So for all the providers in the room, maybe that's something we should all think about, how to take better care of wounds and integrate all these services that clearly are so needed in our population. And as Dr. Widmeyer has said, testing is the first step. If we're able to offer testing, then we can do the hard work of maybe peer linkage, right, to services or TB services, right, and ongoing peer support for linkage to services, addressing social determinants, so that people actually have a best chance to end up with the good story that Professor Story mentioned in his story. Andrew?
No, I think what's really interesting is from a low and middle income setting, the context is so different. So, I mean, we have an epidemic of tuberculosis in South Africa, but also it's not well funded. Our harm reduction programs do not do very well to screen for TB, but we are pretty good at screening for HIV. And there's been quite positive developments in South Africa and the Global Fund around using mobile digital x-rays, which then link with our outreach services. But I think even finding people that have expertise in managing and working with people who use drugs around tuberculosis and injecting drugs, or drug use generally, is just lacking. So I think it's very clearly not only a research issue, it's a capacity issue in contexts where we have very large epidemics. So, I think it's really great that we're able to have these discussions in different contexts and to try and hear what's happening in different diseases and health conditions. And most impactful for me was you sharing your personal story, so thank you. And yeah, back to you for closing.
Do we have any final questions? Yes.
It's not really a question, it's like invest in peer workforces. That's how you do this, include people who are affected by it.
Exactly.
Yes, I completely agree. Question?
Just a comment, really. I come from Nurses on Wheels. It's a harm reduction service in Oslo, Norway. And we do a lot of the things that we are talking about now. So I just want to show you that it is possible. We do wound care. Oh, sorry. We do wound care, HCV testing, COVID testing. We try to fill in the gaps that exist in the system. So, and we have a mobile unit, so we can go to people's homes, so we can meet people on the streets, so we can treat people in the van. So, it's possible.
Thank you so much to all our speakers. Ms. Russell, thank you for your powerful story. Thank you for challenging us to be and do better. Thank you, Professor Story, for the amazing story. And thank you, Professor Widmeyer, for updating us on the latest trends. We do have an injecting equipment provision van outside during the conference. It's located through the front entrance of the venue and to the left in the car park. If you would like to take a tour or find out more information, please feel free to visit the van or see the team in the frying room. Join us for the Point of Care HCV RNA Diagnostics Improved Test and Treat Pathways Symposium tomorrow morning at 8 a.m. in the Lamond Auditorium. There are still tickets available for the conference dinner on Thursday. I've been to the dinner before, it's great. Please see the help desk to purchase one. Thank you so much for joining us on this session. We hope that you continue to have an amazing conference. Thank you, everyone.